Hi, everyone. My name is Lee Orphan. I'm a bicycle tour leader with Bicycle Breeze, and I've been enjoying Cuba for a couple of decades now. And one thing that my wife and I have done is a lot of cycling in Cuba, as well as spending time at the resorts and generally making our way around the island and meeting the people and having a great time. This winter, I'm running two bike tours along with my wife, one in January and one in February. But the purpose of the presentation today is just to go over a presentation that I obtained through a friend. The presentation was made by the Cuban Tourism Ministry in Toronto, and it just goes over the current status of tourism in Cuba and what it's like and what Cuba's goals are in terms of promoting tourism going forward and what to expect in the coming years. So I'll just jump right into the presentation. And the presentation itself, as I say, was produced by the Cuban government, and I've made a few minor edits to it just for clarity, but essentially this is their presentation. So the concern that Cuba's had continues to have been related to the blockade by the United States, which has seriously affected Cuban tourism and the livelihood of Cuban people. The embargo has made it more challenging for Americans to visit Cuba, but they still can visit. There's really no barriers beyond obtaining a visa, which would be on the grounds of supporting the Cuban people. Our bike tours provide the opportunity for Americans to support the Cuban people by meeting with Cuban youth cycling clubs. We make donations of equipment to them. We encourage our clients to bring donations, and it gives us and our clients an opportunity to meet the Cuban people and support them. Let's move along. Actually, it's just back on that previous slide, just to mention, I mean, I was speaking here in terms of the United States. About half of the clients we have are from Canada, about half are from the United States, and a small portion are from other countries. And this slide just makes it clear that Cuba is ready this coming winter, 2022-2023, to receive visitors. Cuba was closed essentially to tourism after March 2020 and through 2021. It reopened in November of 2021 to tourism, and we had some really good tours last winter. My wife and I were there for January and February in 2022 and had an amazingly good time. This slide just presents that from 2015 to 2019, the hotel sector in Cuba grew by 5.8%, and it was the second largest growth area in their economy. In terms of COVID, Cuba has made huge strides. They have their own vaccine, and they've vaccinated over 92% of their complete population, the age 2 and up. However, for tourists, there are from Canada, the United States, and all the European countries I'm aware of, no restrictions in terms of vaccination or testing to either come to Cuba or return home. So that's a huge improvement from the previous year for tourists. This slide just describes how many airports there are. So there's 10 international airports open to receive visitors from around the world, 3 cruise terminals, and 10 ports and international marinas available. This slide is really interesting. It just shows the really significant amount of growth. The gray bars are the number of hotel rooms that are available for tourists, and that's been growing steadily since 1990. The blue line shows the number of tourists visiting Cuba, and that increased. And in 2016, 17, 18, the number of visitors was actually higher than the number of available hotel rooms. And I'm assuming that that surplus was taken up by bed and breakfasts in Cuba, which are called casas particular in Cuba, and they're a very common way of staying. Most Americans tend to stay at casas. And then what you see on the right side of this graph is in 2020, of course, COVID arrived. Tourism was virtually shut down. And in 2021, it just began to pick up again. And their goal for 2022 is 2.5 million tourist arrivals to Cuba. And they've continued to develop additional hotel rooms right through COVID. In terms of in 1995 to 2019, Canada's been the largest source of tourists to Cuba. And you see United States was becoming a very significant source of tourists from 2010 through to 2019. We really hope that that can maintain, because stronger relationships between Canada, the United States, and Cuba can only benefit Cubans and ourselves. This slide is 2021, so this is the first year of recovery coming out of COVID. And what you see here is that a very large percentage of the people, 42.8% of the tourists visiting Cuba, were from Russia in 2021. They, when we arrived in January, our resort was primarily the visitors were Russians, which was very unusual to us. And I'll be honest, it wasn't particularly pleasant. They were more difficult to get along with than other people. But the war in Ukraine suddenly arose, and because Russians were flying over the North Pole, over America and Canada to get between Russia and Cuba, they all had to leave because they couldn't fly over that airspace. And to my knowledge, the Russians haven't really returned, and I would really hope that we can see an opportunity going forward for Canadians, Americans, and Europeans to really pick up the tourism business in Cuba and make that the preferred clientele. Cuba's made big efforts recently to promote that they're more than just the sun and the beach. And here's just a description of some of the more significant sites. UNESCO has been very active, declaring biospheres and cultural heritage sites. There's 14 national parks and a whole lot of other really interesting things to see as you travel around Cuba off the beach. This slide just shows how many rooms there are in each of the provinces. So the largest tourism provinces are Havana, Matanzas, Villa Clara, and Ciego de Villa. And Ciego de Villa has Cayo Coco, so that's where that number comes from. But there's also a large number of hotel rooms available off the beaten path and in the smaller, less touristy provinces. And the bike tours we run cover the whole of the island. And we do a lot of tours in central Cuba around Havana. In this area, you see colonial cities and some really nice southern and northern coast beaches. A very popular loop goes west from Havana and covers the western portion of the island, seeing the tobacco lands. And we call it a tailwind tour because the predominant breezes in Cuba are east to west. We also run tours in the east. So a tour of the Guantanamo area here and another tour around the Sierra Maestra Range here. So the other thing you'd notice, and the reason I kind of went over that area, is those tours take us to some of the more quiet parts of the country, less touristy, less of the big tourist hotels, and quite honestly, I think a lot more interesting. This slide describes the situation in Cuba, where historically Wi-Fi on internet access for tourists was more problematic than you'd expect in North America or Europe. And here they're showing that they're going to have 78% of hotel rooms will have Wi-Fi in the hotel in 2022. That's going to be really helpful to people. And I've also heard that they're making it easier to access the Wi-Fi within the hotel, whether it's Wi-Fi in the room or Wi-Fi without challenges in terms of getting an internet access card to see Wi-Fi. In terms of the monetary system in Cuba, this is always a source of confusion, I have to admit. It's more complicated than it should be, but it kind of goes back to the embargo insofar as US dollar bills do not circulate in Cuba legally, and they're not useful to Cubans. Cubans that have get payment in American dollars, which occurs, they'll get tips in American dollars. They need to trade those dollars with other Cubans on the black market. Some people will want those American bills because they're going to go shopping in the States and bring things back to Cuba to sell or to give to their family. So that's where American dollars tend to end up. However, the good news is, first of all, the CUC, or the convertible peso, was taken out of circulation at the end of 2020. And currently, they call it money freely convertible, and that includes Canadian dollars, euros, pound sterling, and many other currencies. And what happens with that is, as a tourist, you can use your Canadian dollars or euros or other freely convertible currencies to make purchases in restaurants and hotels. That works really well. The exchange rates are extremely favorable. Just in terms of the currencies, the other aspect is you can use credit cards at the large hotels in Cuba. They work quite well, as long as they're not issued by an American bank. And again, that goes back to the embargo. So, so if you're traveling to Cuba, I would recommend taking Canadian dollars or euros or similar currency as your predominant source of money. Take as much cash as you're comfortable with, because you'll get a better exchange rate exchanging your money directly with a restaurant or exchanging it for Cuban pesos with people in Cuba. And use your credit cards from non-US banks. And in a minute, the next slide talks about Americans being able to use debit cards in Cuba. So yeah, this is the prepaid card or debit cards that are available in Cuba. So Americans can purchase these things in Cuba, convert their money into a debit, pay for items at hotels and restaurants with the debit card, and then at the end of the visit to Cuba, exchange or turn your card back in and take the cash back out, whatever's left over before you go back home. Cuba, like a lot of countries during COVID, implemented a website for inputting your travel information before you arrive. They call it De Viajeros in Cuba. And we used it last year. It worked quite well. Something they've got new this year is an app that tracks your check-in. So that's new for this year, and I haven't experienced that one myself. Cuba's got a lot of vehicles available. So if you want to rent a car, they are there. They're readily available. You can travel anywhere you want in the country. There's really no restrictions. There's also a very good system of tourist buses in the tourist areas. And there are shuttle buses, essentially taxis between airports and hotels, that are very commonly available and quite inexpensive. So again, Cuba wants to promote itself as a beach destination and more. And just as you see in this picture, the beaches in Cuba are spectacular. Ecotourism is a really big area. We, during our bike tours, go on a few hikes. Whatever part of Cuba we're in, there's places where you can find waterfalls and walks in the forest. The countryside is beautiful. It's not as industrialized as what we're used to seeing from North America or Europe, with a lot of tractors. They still do a lot of plowing with oxen, and it's really interesting cycling around the countryside or taking a Jeep tour and seeing, what's available in the countryside of Cuba. Bird watching is popular. A lot of birds migrate through Cuba, so it's a very popular destination for this. Some adventure tours are beginning. Of course, diving has been popular around Cuba for years. There's some amazing reefs to dive on, and some very good snorkeling as well. City tours are always popular, and the vintage cars here in Havana are commonly available and a really cool experience. This is just a picture of Havana. This is the fortress at the mouth of the bay in Santiago de Cuba on the eastern coast, southeastern coast. Performers in Old Town of Havana, you'll find them on the street, and spectacular. The Havana Viejo is a beautiful area to walk around and see the sights and see the culture. I was mentioning earlier that the tour that I'm leading, Maria La Gorda, heads south through western Cuba, which is the tobacco growing land. It's a beautiful magotes. These are limestone hills in the area, and those are the tobacco fields. We'll see tobacco grown, and we'll see people hand rolling cigars for us. Cuba is very well known for its rum, and you can see some range of rums there to taste, from white rum through to rum anejo and 7-year rums and such. And as I mentioned, tobacco and cigars are a huge part of the culture in Cuba. A lot of hotels have been renovated. This slide just indicates how much renovation's been going on, and people that have been to Cuba in the past, you'll often be seeing hotels that have been largely renovated in the last 2 or 3 years. A lot of airlines are now flying into Cuba. The flights from America to Cuba had been only to Havana. However, beginning fall of 2022, there are flights to, I think it's six international airports now in Cuba. There's a couple slides here which are branded on the Unica brand, which is uniqueness of Cuba. This one refers to its Cuban culture, and there's ballet, there's music, there's museums, there's theaters, there's bookstores, there's nightclubs and bars, and all sorts of culture to explore in Cuba. The beaches and climate are amazing, 580 kilometers of coastline. The island itself is about 1,250 kilometers end to end. We run cycling tours across the entirety of the island, so we know the island really well. And the beaches are spectacular. And in the wintertime, when we're there, beginning in November, the daytime highs might be in the vicinity of 28 degrees Celsius on average. By March, it's the average daytime temperature. The high would be around 30, 32. By the summer, it's too hot, and we don't run bike tours there in the summer, and the tourism drops off. So the main tourism season is the cooler, drier part from November through to about April, May. As I say, it's dry at that time of year, and the climate's good. I mentioned the daytime highs. The daytime lows tend to be around 19 degrees, 20 degrees in the evening, pretty consistently. If you go into the mountains, you'll find slightly cooler temperatures. Cuba's nature is amazing. Valleys, caves, rivers. I mentioned the magotes. We saw those pictures of those hillocks, the steep-sided residual hills of limestone. But everywhere you go, you'll find different types of nature and a different geography just to explore. Not everyone thinks of Cuba for its food, but it has rum, honey, coffee, sugar. It mixes different culinary styles from around the world. And if you get out into the towns and you find paladars, for example, which are private restaurants. Originally, they were in people's homes. Now they're starting to look a little bit more like restaurants. These are great opportunities to experience good Cuban food and Cuban culture. There's a lot of history in Cuba, revolutions, including the Cuban Revolution to end its connection to Spain, and then the more commonly known revolution where Fidel took over and created a Cuba that was separate from outside interference. Hospitality and kindness are a hallmark of Cuba. It's got a wide range of hotels. Our tours, typically, we're going to casas, which are the bed and breakfasts, or 3- and 4-star hotels. Some of the hotels are 5-star or better. Health and safety is a big thing in Cuba. Again, just in terms of our cycling tours, there are very few Cubans actually own a car. That's not how a typical Cuban would get around. They would take taxis and buses. They walk, they ride bikes. And as a result, when people are driving cars in Cuba, the taxi drivers and so on, they've experienced Cuba and the roads from a cycling, walking perspective. And we find Cuba is just a fantastic destination because the roads are quieter and the safety is really good cycling on the roads. The roads themselves are pretty typical of what I experience in Canada, where some of the roads are excellent, some of them are tar and chip and are just sort of passable. And occasionally they're not very good. Occasionally there's gravel roads or potholes, and it depends on where you are. But in general, we find cycling there very safe. In terms of driving, you can rent cars, but most people prefer to hire a driver to drive them around. And I think that's probably a better choice. I mentioned before that Cuba developed its own COVID vaccines, and they've been very successful. COVID really has been almost eliminated within Cuba, and their measures have been very successful. Cuba also has excellent dentists and doctors, and when you're traveling there, if you need any medical attention, it's certainly available. The diversity of Cuba with its mix of races is very important to Cuban society. They do consider themselves to be a very inclusive state and very multicultural, and that's part of their identity. In terms of the friendliness, everyone that goes to Cuba, sometimes they'll complain that a hotel was not the way they wanted it to be, or maybe they didn't like a restaurant, but they never complain about the people. The people always treat you with respect and dignity. They want to be treated the same, of course, and they're always smiling and happy and great to deal with. So yeah, the Cuban people. It's one of the things that makes traveling to Cuba great. Cubans really do enjoy having tourists. They really appreciate having tourists come to visit their country, and they're very dependent on us for money. Many people's jobs are in the tourism industry, and they're really keen to get back to work as we recover from COVID. Tips are an extremely important part of what keeps Cubans going. So when you're there, please do tip people generously. It's really important to them. And one of the things that I've been talking to people about when they're considering doing our bike tours, people are concerned because they know that there are shortages of food in Cuba, and the Cuban people are suffering from the impact of the embargo and the collapse of their economy. However, the Cuban tourism industry is the main source of them to obtain hard currencies, and hard currencies are required for them to purchase food, and fertilizer and oil on the international market. So by traveling to Cuba, you're actually supporting Cubans. You're making it possible for Cuba to purchase the food and oil that it needs to feed its people. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation. As I say, it was presentation was written by the Cuban Travel Agency, and I've just used as an opportunity to present my own perspective on Cuban tourism. And I hope that you can find the time to come to Cuba in the future and experience Cuba with us. Either with Bicycle Breeze on a bicycle tour, or just come to the country and explore it yourself. Come to the hotels, the casas, travel around on your own, and enjoy Cuba. And I hope the presentation was helpful. And if you have any questions, feel free to post them. I'm going to put the presentation on my YouTube channel, and I'll answer any questions that come up there. And while you're there, you might want to poke around and see some of the beautiful footage that we have of cycling in Cuba and traveling in Cuba and meeting people in Cuba and hanging out, having a great time in Cuba. So again, hope the presentation was helpful, and best wishes, and hope to see you in Cuba sometime soon.